So the structure of the United States very much follows a secret society type structure or just typical organizational structures. You have the illuminated ones or the most powerful ones at the top, and then you sort of filter down to the plebs at the bottom, like us. Um, so in the United Nations, there's sort of three main levels in the United Nations, but that then filters down to two other levels. So you've got the Security Council at the top, which is 5 permanent members for United States, France, United Kingdom, Russia, and China. And so they're always there in that Security Council. They're the ones who can decide who they're going to make war upon, all of that really aggressive stuff. Then you have the General Assembly, which is made up of 193 countries, member states, as they call them, and then which I consider the kings, if you think about Revelation 17. So that's the two parts that are considered the kings. But then you have the great men of the earth, which it talks about in Revelation 18. And these are your NGOs, your civil societies, and so forth that are united with the United Nations. And at the moment, there is 40,000 plus NGOs of the United Nations. So it's quite large in number. So you go from 5 to 193 to like massive. But then you get people under that who are influencers of some sort. So you might have politicians, you might have social media influencers, you may have church leaders who are following in the footsteps of those who are at the higher levels of the United Nations, maybe directly or indirectly. And then you have general society, us, who receive the instruction from them either by watching movies or going to uni or school, and they teach us all about sustainable development and all of the UN's goals, and they tell us that that's the way we should think. And so this is how they actually are working, and you can see this in their documents, how they talk about, and I'll show you in a minute. But I think it's very interesting, their structure, because I think the United States kind of right back when they started printing money gave a fairly good indication that they would always be at the head of the UN. So you know your dollar bill more than I do. At the head of that dollar, at the pyramid, is the all-seeing eye. I'm hoping you can still hear me. Are you still there, James?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, good. So you've got the all-seeing eye at the top, which is kind of like the UN structure, but it's interesting because this is on your dollar bill.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it on your dollar bill? Because it then he favors our undertakings. Now, we know that God does not work like this. We just spoke about it at the very beginning. God likes to reveal secrets. He doesn't like to keep them.
Correct.
And so what kind of person is favoring their undertakings? And the other part down the bottom says a new order of the ages. Now, this is also very occult language because that's what Shambhala is all about, is about having this new world that is, at peace and all the rest of it. And I thought this was interesting. It was actually my son that picked this up. He said, "Look at the spider webs, Mum."
Wait, oh, yes.
Around each of the ones is a spider, like it's a clear spider web, but you can see the pattern is repeated. And
Yes.
there's things on the web that say, "Oh, this is a conspiracy. It's just part of our security features." Well, I can tell you, we've got security features on our paper money too. It's not a spider web. You can have other kind of security features. And I thought it was interesting because as I have been doing the research around this, I could talk for hours and hours and still not exhaust all of the research that I have. I have when I was putting together this presentation, I had double the amount of slides, and I'm like, oh, what can I cut out? Because it's like this tangled web. And I thought this quote, "Oh, what a tangled web we weave when we practice to deceive." I believe that was the whole point of the United States. They set out to deceive the world into thinking that they were a godly nation. And they were, a lot of founding fathers were godly people, but the people that got into power very quickly were not godly. And so if that says "in God we trust," I'm not sure which God would have an all-seeing eye.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I do know. It's not the God of the Bible.
That's right.
So how much power does the United States have in the UN? I've just given a quick screenshot of the journal article that I read, but I'm going to give you some quotes from it now. The League of Nations, which is the precursor to the UN, was a brainchild of US President Woodrow Wilson, mentioned in his 14 points for resolution of the Great War in January 1919. This was his idea. In January 1941, the US President Franklin D. Roosevelt proclaimed his aspiration for the four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear, which paved the way for the formation of the United Nations, sorry. In this quote here, directly from the article, it says, in November and December of 1943, Roosevelt, Churchill, which was obviously the UK's Prime Minister, and Stalin, which we all know about, met at Tehran, which is in Iran, interestingly. Roosevelt laid out to Stalin his personal vision of the single international body. So whose vision was the UN? It was America's. A necessary step was that the diplomats of the principal allied countries would develop a draft of a charter for the new United Nations. So this is in 1943. The United Nations was not formed until 1945. So Roosevelt, this was his brainchild.
Mercy.
Why is that? Because I believe they were signaling that on their dollar bill. We want to be the head of the world. And the only way that we can do that is if we unite all of the nations together and we are in charge of them. Now, this is what this article, or this journal article says about the veto vote that the five permanent member states have. It says the UN Charter's veto rights constrain how and whether the organization can respond to conditions of interest to or self-interest of the permanent member states. So it's saying that the five permanent member states have such power that they can actually set the direction of the United Nations based on their own self-interest. The lack of responsiveness to the question of mass atrocity crime specifically traced to the use of the veto or the threat of the veto. So it's saying when the UN has actually been unable, so the Human Rights Commission has been unable to go forward with dealing with human atrocities, it is because of the veto votes. So this is how powerful they are. Then it says the existence of the vetoes also factored into whether there was ever a UN at all. So if there was no veto, there would have been no UN, because the rights are commonly presented as a fait accompli. Thus, Richard Goldstone said, there is no question that without permanent membership and the veto vote power, China, the Soviet Union, the UK, and the United States would not have joined the newly formed organization. Wow. So they did not want to join unless they had the ability to veto vote. That's why we know that the veto votes are so intrinsically connected to the overarching governance of the UN. Now, if you look at this chart here, you would think to yourself, well, hang on, Russia has, or USSR and then Russia has been the most inclined to use the veto vote, then America. So maybe Russia actually is in charge of the UN. How can you say that the US is in charge? Well, let me show you something. This is an article, another journal article that it's not analyzing data, it's just history. It's a history lesson on the use of the veto votes in the UN. And it says it's called Unblocking the UN Security Council, the Uniting for Peace Resolution. Now, the US Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, along with delegates Benjamin Cohen and John Foster Dulles, pressed for a creative reading of the UN Charter. So let's make things flexible, please. At the September 1950 annual session of the General Conference, the UN delegation requested the addition of an item to the Assembly's agenda, accompanied by the following note. The Charter gives the General Assembly important functions to perform in the field of international peace and security, including the right to discuss any question relating to this field and the right to make recommendations. The experience of the United Nations in the 5 years since the Charter came into force, so 1945, it came into force, 1950, this is what's happening. In the 5 years since the Charter came into force, has demonstrated the value of the Assembly's role. In the view of the United States, the Assembly's contribution can be enhanced, both with respect to the avoidance of conflicts and with respect to the restoration of peace, if need arises. And then jump down to this next paragraph. It says, to this end, the United States proposes that the Assembly should make provision for emergency special sessions to be convoked in 24 hours. So they're talking about, in this article, they're talking about how the veto vote had been used too much by the USSR at that point in time, and they were blocking resolutions from being passed. And the US is going, hey, this is not working. We need to somehow circumvent this veto vote. We're going to go to the General Assembly and we're going to ask them to pass a resolution that if anyone blocks something at the Security Council through their veto vote, we can go to the General Assembly and ask them to override it. And so this is what happened. In spite of strenuous objection from the Soviet delegation, USSR, General Assembly resolution uniting for peace was adopted to a vote of 52-5 on the 3rd of November, 1950. The General Assembly of the day contained a secure majority of Western states and their allies. So this is the whole point. So the US was able to continue getting away with their veto votes, but the USSR could make a veto vote. They would quickly go to the General Assembly. The US would quickly go to the General Assembly and say, hey, you need to stop them. Western allies that make up the General Assembly, you need to stop them. You need to override their veto vote. So who do you think has the power?
Mercy.
Okay,
Wow.
now let's just look at money side of things. So United States contributes to the UN's regular budget $748 million, which is 22% of the regular budget. Russia only 54.5. So comparative wise, they might have a lot of veto votes, but money wise, they rank right down. When you look at peacekeeping budget, America is the only one that's listed in the billions. 1.5 billion, the rest of them are in the millions. And Russia, 128 million, well below some of the top contributors. Then if you look at voluntary contributions, the United States voluntarily contributes $13 billion every year. They're the top money givers to the United Nations. So you know how Donald Trump was actually pulling out of UN sort of sidearms. He wasn't pulling out of the Security Council because they wouldn't want to do that. But he was pulling out of the WHO and is pulling out, I think, of one, or suggesting that he'd pull out of something else. But this is just all manipulation tactics because they are the money bags of the UN. And so this is what this article says about Trump 2.0 and what it means for the United Nations. The US is likely to use funding as a tool for targeted reforms of the UN bodies. Mr. Trump will adapt first-term strategies, which he tried to cause reforms in the UN, but he will adapt them so that this time round those reforms will be resolved. And he will use multilateral cooperation to make sure that the UN efforts align with US interests. So who's in charge of the UN? It continues on saying the Trump administration worked with the UN and supported it financially when it saw value in its activities. Early in 2017, Mr. Trump hosted members of the UN Security Council at the White House, urging action on North Korea. At that time, he said, the United Nations is an underperformer, but has huge potential to achieve what I want. I'm just adding that bit in there. And then he says, in each year of the first Trump administration, the US provided more funding to the UN system than any other year under President Obama. Indeed, the US remained by far the largest contributor in both assessed and voluntary funding to the UN system under President Trump. Double or even triple the amount of the second largest contributor, China. So he is not trying to withdraw from the UN. I just want to say that some people have thought that that's what he's doing. He's manipulating the UN to do what the US wants.
That's it.
Because if he can get the UN to do what the US wants, he can get the UN to do what the first beast of Revelation, the whore of Babylon, wants.
Mercy. I want to... boy. It's a lot to process. Yeah, you need to take a drink of water. You need that. I gotta tell you, I had brother Jay. I think he's in the chat right now, listening to us. He did a presentation a couple weeks ago, and he was connecting the UN to the French Revolution, and he showed that some of the elements and principles of the French Revolution are so much more part of the UN, and some of the agendas that you see in the UN came from French Revolution itself. And even when the UN agenda was signed, the League of Nations met in France, and all these elements was connected. But the reason I'm saying
Yes.
this is because when you went through those prophecy studies of Revelation 17, it could also be said, yeah, maybe the eighth head, instead of saying, okay, is the UN, you can also say it has adapted all the other elements of these nations that came from the bottomless pit. It has in it, it's like a eclectic kind of way of looking at it, right? It adapted certain principles similar to that what the women's church has done, right? When the Catholic Church came, it took on, some of the Romans elements. That's why it's a composite beast that's made of, Babylon, Medo Persia, Greece, and Rome. So he has those elements. So I'm just simply saying it could also be
Mhm.
another way to consider it, that some of those principles in the UN is made of all different agendas in one,
That's right.
and ultimately
That's right.
the woman rides that beast. So yeah.
Yes, exactly. So going back to the eighth head, I actually believe that the beast is America, and the eighth head is also representative of America, but America using or religion using America to achieve its objectives. So it's kind of like the Protestant America, state and church combined, because that's what you see in all of their other heads before it is state and church combined. So you have America, the state power in the beast, and America, the state, America with the religious and state powers combined in the head. This is my way of trying to unpack it. But as I said, I'm not an expert and I'm still studying it. I spent the whole of last year, I had this thing, I was like, I need to understand Revelation more. And so I spent all of last year just studying Revelation. And I got to the end of last year and I went, I think I can pretty much pick up any part of Revelation now and have a fairly lucid idea of what it's talking about. But as I went back and studied Revelation 17 again for this presentation, I went, oh, wow, there's so much more. So I don't think I've gotten to the end of it. And I'm not, as I said, an expert. So the question is, if the UN is the 10 kings or the 10 horns, or represented by those 10 horns of the Revelation 17 beast, if it is the UN, then it must also have clearly drunken the wine of Babylon, because that's what it says about those 10 kings. So the question is, has it drunk from the wine of Babylon? And that's where we're going to look at now. So the wine of Babylon was very first mentioned in Daniel chapter 5. Like, that's where you can get a really clear description of what it actually looks like. So they use the Lord's vessels. I always get confused. Is it Belteshazzar or Belshazzar? Because I know one is Daniel and the other one's the king.
Yeah,
I think it's Belshazzar.
Belteshazzar was Daniel. Belshazzar was
Yeah, so it's Belshazzar.
hmm
So Belshazzar was using the Lord's vessels. Now, what is the Lord's vessels these days? It is God's church, his people,
That's right.
to practice idolatry, which is a false teaching. And idolatry is essentially spiritualism, because you're applying life and
hmm
divinities to something that's like a piece of wood or stone or whatever. Like, that's false doctrine and it's spiritualism. So he's using God's church, God's people,
mm
to disseminate this false doctrine.
mm
And then the union that he has at the beginning of Daniel 5, it says all of the princes come together. So it's kind of like all of the, great men, all of the kings come together to drink with him, and they're all on the brink of ruin. They're like the enemy's on the outside. The king of the east is about to come in, and they're just like, yeah, let's all party and drink our doctrine because it's all good. Everything's going to be fine.
Yep.
They cannot, as a result, understand the words of God. So they have to
Mm.
call Daniel in. And Daniel actually says to Belshazzar, hey, don't you remember your grandfather? You've forgotten the past.
Mm-hmm.
Remember what happened to him, but you haven't remembered that. And so therefore you are so proud in your heart. You haven't repented. And now you've been judged as wanting, and you're warned that you're about to lose everything, and he still doesn't repent. So this is what the wine of Babylon looks like. And eventually, of course, he dies. So if we want to understand what it means to drink from the wine of Babylon, it is actually a pseudo church, really, a God's people, but not really God's people, because they're actually drinking the false doctrines and they're uniting with the world, and they're not listening to the words of God and not repenting. In Revelation 16, talking about the plagues that come, it says that there's spirits of devils that go out to all the kings of the earth to deceive the whole world. So this is spiritualism, is one of the key things that we know we must be looking for at the end of time. And I believe that the cosmic mind is really spiritualism in a way. So I want to just talk about spiritualism, because a lot of people, and I spoke about this in my first presentation, a lot of people talk about spiritualism as just being communicating with spirits, which people often think are the dead that have come back to life, but it's not, it's spirits. And people will just stop at that definition. But Ellen White has a whole bunch more that she can add to this. And so the first bit that I'm going to add is that the whole idea of spiritualism is putting aside God's word, his laws and his truth. So she says man is accountable only to themselves. There's no difference between righteousness and sin. The Bible is interpreted in a manner that's pleasing to self. There's weak sentimental love is dwelt on as the chief attribute of God. They reject the Bible as the foundation, and they follow the philosophy and traditions of men. These are all things that she associates with spiritualism. But essentially, if you just go, we reject God's word, that's what they all sum up to be. The other area is everything or everyone has godlike virtue or power. So you have man has power in himself to accomplish great works. They cease to rely on the merits of God's or Christ's blood, and they have false healing that are unconnected to the precepts of God. You don't have to follow God's laws to actually receive healing. So all of these things are associated with spiritualism as well. Now, sustainable development is spiritualism. You hear this term used all over the shop, in schools, in churches, in news, and all sorts of places, but it starts from the United Nations. Why do I say it's spiritualism? Listen to the words sustainability. This is from the UN. I'm not taking it from other dictionaries. Sustainability as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So what I do helps those in the future meet their needs, because I have something to do to influence them. There is an element of truth to that, but there's an element of error too. And then development is multidimensional. Is a multidimensional undertaking to achieve a higher quality of life for all people. But notice how there is no reference to the law or the words of God to do any of these things. It's reliant on man to do this. There's no crying out to God. Man is its own savior and savior of the planet. So from this perspective, it is spiritualism. We put aside the words of God and we place ourselves in the position of redeemer. So this is from the preamble on the Sustainable Development Goals. It says the agenda is a plan of action for people, planet, and prosperity. All countries and all stakeholders acting in collaborative partnership will implement this plan. So that includes all NGOs, mind you, to heal and secure our planet. Can we really heal and secure our planet? To provide a sustainable and resilient path. We pledge that no one will be left behind. We'll balance these three things, and it's of critical importance. You notice how this language is very much about humanity saves the planet and saves itself.
It's salvation by works. It's really it's a man-made religion again. But how can you heal and secure the planet if you don't address the sin problem? It's never going to be done. You can't. So evil.
So this is spiritualism.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that's spiritualism is unity and diversity. So putting aside beliefs. So I don't have a problem with unity and diversity with, our cultures, in terms of, I'm Australian, you're American, and, or our skin color or our gender. The Bible makes that very clear. There is meant to be no difference on these things, but beliefs, you don't go unity with diversity on beliefs. God makes that very clear too.
Yes.
And to try and do that is actually spiritualism. So this is the UN Assembly President calls for global unity as high-level debate concludes. He says, the President of the General Assembly on Monday reminded the UN member states that the organization's strength lies in our diversity and ability to unite about common goals as the curtain drew on the 79th session's highest level debate. So saying, as long as we unite, that's the most important thing, and we can come from different beliefs, but that's okay. This is on the UN, one place where the world's nations can gather together, discuss common problems, and find shared solutions.
Mercy.
Now, remember I spoke about the Black Lodge? They actually speak about the evolving humanity here, because it says the UN has evolved over the years to keep pace with the rapidly changing world. But one thing has stayed the same, and then they replace this idea of the one place, and then it says it benefits the whole of humanity. And over underneath the video, it actually says the most impossible job on earth. All of these UN Secretary Generals who've been the head of the UN have the most impossible job on the earth because they're trying to unite the entire world. Now, in 2024, at the very end of 2024, they signed off on the Pact for the Future. Someone sent me a video, and on that video, it was like a short of this lady talking, and she was talking about how they were all going to microchip us and all this kind of thing, and that was in the Pact for the Future. I went reading through the entire document. I don't want to break people's bubbles here, but it doesn't say that in there. I just thought I'd say that. It might allude to it. I don't know how the person where they got that information from, because it's not in the Pact for the Future, but there is enough in here to know what their agenda is.
Yeah.
Let's just read some of the things that they say. Science, technology, and innovation and digital cooperation. Science, technology, and innovation accelerate the realization of the aspirations of the United Nations. So what is the aspirations of the United Nations? To unite the world under peace. And it's interesting because 2024 also started the International Decade of Sciences for Sustainable Development. And it talks about in there being more enlightened. Now, all of the member states signed off on this. So every country that is a member, which is every country, signed off on this document. And this is what they agreed to. We will strengthen the United Nations system. So if it's got power now, we'll give it even greater power, which means America gets greater power, if we remember the link. We will strengthen our partnerships. So this is partnerships between, if you look down on the highlighted bit, it says efforts must involve governments, the UN's, as well as parliaments, the UN's nations system, and other international institutions, local authorities, Indigenous people, civil society, business, the private sector, faith-based organizations, the scientific and academic communities, and all people. That's that pyramid that they just went through. Not quite in the same picture, but that's what they were talking about. We are going to make sure that our people in all different facets of society are going to implement our agenda.